I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower Podcast, we are discussing ethnic minority policy in China. What are the current CCP policies toward ethnic minorities, and how have they evolved through various Chinese leadership? How has China's policies towards these groups influenced its foreign policy and impacted its international image? Joining us to discuss this important topic is Dr. Aaron Glasserman. Dr. Glasserman is a current Academy Scholar at the Harvard Academy for International and Area Studies and a former postdoctoral research associate at Princeton University. He earned his PhD from Columbia University in 2021 with his dissertation focusing on the history of the Hui Muslim ethnic group in China. Dr. Glasserman has written for Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the China Quarterly, China File, Project Syndicate, and other publications, with areas of expertise in China's minority politics and Islam in China. He is a current Wilson Center Fellow at the Wilson Center. Thank you for joining us, Aaron.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks so much for having me.
So I would like to start with asking, how diverse is China? How many ethnic minorities does China have? And what does it mean if you're not of the Han majority?
So I think there are sort of two ways that you could think about that question. There's a kind of deceptively simple answer, which is that there are officially, according to the Chinese government, 56 officially recognized ethnic groups, or what are called nationalities, minzu in Chinese, in the People's Republic of China. It's about 9% of the population. A little bit less is non-Han, so the 55 minority nationalities. And as of the 2020 census, that came out to about 125 million people. So that's sort of the simple, straightforward answer using official categories. But there's a more complicated way of thinking about it too. First of all, it's not as though these different ethnic groups are equivalent, right? So they vary tremendously in terms of size from, nearly 20 million with the Zhuang in southwest China, in Guangxi and Yunnan, South China, and then down to just a few thousand with the Gaoshan and Tatars. So there's a range there. There's also a range in terms of the degree of what you could call assimilation, so how much they speak Mandarin or Putonghua, standard Chinese, or its local dialect, the way in which people have settled. So many minority nationalities are concentrated in one or a few parts of the country, regions, but some are scattered throughout the country. For example, the Hui, which I've specialized in the past, they're distinctive because they're actually found in every province, virtually every major city. So that's another distinction. You could also look at cross-national ties, right? So some minority nationalities have sort of a corresponding group in another country. So there are ethnic Koreans who are recognized as official group in the PRC. And of course, there are Koreans just across the border in North Korea and then South Korea. Likewise for Kazakhs, for Mongols, Inner Mongolia versus the Republic of Mongolia. You could also look at differences in terms of political history. So some of these groups are quite small and maybe did not have a high degree of political and social organization prior to 1949, the establishment of the People's Republic. Some of them have a very long history of sort of independent political organization, and in some cases were even previous rulers of much of what is China. So, for example, the Manchus, who are officially recognized today, were, of course, the group that in the Qing dynasty was ruled by a Manchu household. You could also then think about diversity within the Han. So even if we're looking within the official majority, the Han, right, so who are about 91, 92% of the entire population, it's not as though, 1.2 billion people are in all ways culturally and even what we might think of as ethnically homogeneous. So, of course, people are familiar with linguistic differences, Mandarin versus Cantonese. A lot of that is elided in the category Han. And of course, local dialects. It's a tremendously diverse, or at least a substantially genetically diverse population as well. So there's a lot that's masked when we simply think of the official majority. Finally, there are also groups that were not formally recognized, but may have had an independent political or cultural consciousness when the Chinese government went around and came up with 56 as the number of minority nationalities that existed. So, there are a couple of ways that we can think about internal diversity within China and what that means.
Given this diversity, which groups are the largest in population after the Han? You mentioned that the Han comprises of 1.2 billion people, or about 90% of the population. Which groups are the largest after the Han?
So in terms of population, after the Han, the largest ethnic group or the most populous minority nationality is the Zhuang. And they're concentrated in southern China. So there's a autonomous region, the Zhuang Guangxi Autonomous Region. It's basically equivalent to a province, much as there's the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region and several others as well. The Zhuang are almost 20 million, and they're largely concentrated in Guangxi, but then also spill over into Yunnan and other nearby provinces. Then there's the Uyghur, who are about 12 million, according to the most recent census data from 2020. They're concentrated, of course, in Xinjiang. The Hui are also around 12 million, just under, and they are, by contrast, spread throughout the country. So there is a Ningxia Hui Autonomous Region, equivalent administratively to Xinjiang and Guangxi and Inner Mongolia and Tibet, but it's not as though all Hui or even a majority of Hui are concentrated there. In fact, they're found throughout the country. And at least for the Mongols and Tibetans, that's around 6 or 7 million. And then you have, a long tail end of sort of decreasing down, maybe roughly 1 million plus Kazakhs, and then getting smaller down to, again, Tatars, Gaoshan, and, groups that have only, roughly, under 5,000 even in some cases.
Thank you, Aaron. Given all these different minority groups, how do the CCP treat them? When we hear about China's ethnic minorities in the United States, we often think of the Uyghurs or the Tibetans as the two groups that worry the Chinese government the most. Is this a correct assessment?
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. I mean, just to give some context into how they probably see it, there are a couple of factors that make those groups particularly problematic in the eyes of the central government and the Chinese Communist Party. I think of it really as a combination of, on the one hand, a very distinct and from a sort of, at least rather nativistic understanding of Chinese culture, foreign culture, religious traditions. So I'm talking about Tibetan Buddhism on the one hand, and Islam and sort of belonging to a Turkic cultural sphere on the other hand with the Uyghurs. That's one element, culture. The other is territorial concentration. So as I was saying before, the Uyghurs are not the only Muslim minority group in China. In contrast, right, to the Hui, though, who are scattered throughout, the Uyghurs are really heavily concentrated in Xinjiang. And so in terms of, again, from the government's point of view, posing a threat, in particularly when it comes to the risk of ethnic separatism, of establishing an independence movement, there's just more risk there from the government's point of view. Which is not to say that other groups that you might, from that perspective, think are less problematic have not had tensions with the government and have not been a source of sort of political instability, at least conflict within the bureaucracy in China. But in general, the fact that the Tibetans and the Uyghurs are both culturally distinct and territorially concentrated, and I would add as a third element, fairly large in terms of just the population size, makes them extra risky from the government's point of view.
And does the CCP have special policies for ethnic minorities?
So there are absolutely special policies for ethnic minorities, and the fact that there are such special policies is kind of core to the CCP's identity and understanding of itself. We might kind of step back a little bit historically and look at the evolution of what in the People's Republic of China is called the national question or the ethnic question. And just to flag that this term ethnic or national in Chinese, minzu, is one and the same. So nationality, ethnic, national, nation, there's a lot of semantic overlap there when we're speaking in Chinese. So the national question is something that the CCP has been grappling with since before the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. So for example, during the Chinese Civil War, which was between the Chinese Communist Party and the Nationalist Party led by Chiang Kai-shek, one of the issues that the CCP politicized to its advantage in order to win support from a broader popular base was the national question. And in the 1930s and 1940s, during World War II and the Civil War, the CCP accused the ruling nationalist party, the Kuomintang, not recognizing the independent national status of various groups, like the Tibetans, in some cases the Uyghurs. I mean, in some cases, these groups did not have the same names and were not organized in the way that they would be after 1949. But broadly speaking, it was an accusation that the CCP made against the Kuomintang that they didn't recognize the independent national status of China's diverse peoples. And so the fact that the CCP, once they took power, did, in fact, recognize these groups as distinct nationalities, ethnic groups, nations, and gave them special policies is really core to kind of the historic identity of the CCP as they defined themselves against their political enemies. Now, as to the specific policies, we're dealing now with 70 plus years of history, so they've changed over time. But broadly, I think you can kind of think of two types of policies. On the one hand, you have sort of positive affirmative action style policies. So, for example, in many cases, minority nationalities are given extra points on the college entrance examination, or may be entitled to other benefits in terms of preferential employment in the public sector and in government. On the other hand, there are also sort of negative policies. So, for much of the implementation of the one-child policy in the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, minority nationalities were not subject to the same one-child restriction that Han Chinese were. So there's both sort of positive and negative aspects. Another key policy that the CCP has extended to minority nationalities, many, although not all of them, is what the CCP refers to as the right of autonomy. In the PRC, since 1949, there's been a system of regional ethnic or regional national autonomy. And in areas where minority nationalities are concentrated, for example, Xinjiang, for example, Guangxi, there are special political configurations which basically guarantee that a certain number of the titular nationalities, so in Xinjiang, the Uyghurs, in Guangxi, the Zhuang, are represented in government and are entitled to a certain, special, there are also privileges in terms of the use of their own languages. So officially in Xinjiang, Uyghur is to be used in certain official contexts. In court, for example, documents put out by the government ought to be translated. And in education, also, you're supposed to have the right to use your own indigenous language. Of course, the actual implementation of these policies has changed over time. But in principle, the fact that the CCP even recognizes different groups as nationalities rather than, say, religious communities or just cultural groups is something that is very core to its identity as it understands itself, vis-a-vis the Kuomintang and its predecessor and rival.
Thank you, Aaron. It's really interesting that you mentioned the CCP has historically sought to extend the right of autonomy to some of the minority groups. And this seems to be in direct contradiction to the CCP's efforts to repress and assimilate many of these same groups into the Han culture. Could you explain this contradiction a bit and what we see in terms of China's actions in Tibet and Xinjiang?
Sure. So I think first it's important to understand that in some ways there isn't a contradiction. In some ways there is, but in some ways there isn't. Why do I say there isn't necessarily a contradiction? Because in terms of the theory that CCP theorists on the national question have articulated for most of the past century, the ultimate outcome of development culturally, economically, politically in the PRC is going to be what in Chinese is called 民族融合, or ethnic fusion, or the fusion of different nationalities into a single entity. This is going to be, people will speak the same language. There will be no differences anymore between different ethnic groups. Now, this, for most of the CCP's history, has been understood as a long-term, almost utopian process or outcome, right? So it will actually happen after the full establishment of communism. This is something that is going to take a very long time to occur. And so it's not as though we can, it's going to happen tomorrow. And in fact, it might be very dangerous and counterproductive to try and accelerate that process because you might provoke a backlash among the very people who you're trying to integrate into the country. So on the one hand, getting rid of differences between ethnic groups and achieving ultimately ethnic fusion is the goal, or is a sort of, from a Marxist kind of teleological point of view, an inevitability, in fact. At the same time, you can't kind of rush the process. And I think it's important to recognize that for a lot of its history, the CCP has seen itself as managing this process of gradual ethnic fusion. So on the one hand, because you need to keep the country together, you can't give people too much autonomy, and you don't want to create sort of too strong of a minority national identity. On the other hand, you don't want to be too repressive or too restrictive, because that will provoke a backlash and actually be counterproductive for winning over that minority nationality for sort of the revolutionary agenda and economic and social development, and they may rebel, right? So it's a balancing act. Of course, it's very hard to square that with what we see today in Xinjiang, and I think here what we have is a shift where periodically in the history of the PRC, we have seen sort of moments or kind of phases of intense politicization of ethnic politics, where people start to argue that actually we do have to accelerate this process of ethnic fusion. And this sort of issue can be weaponized by different politicians, different officials against one another. And so, for example, going back to the 1950s, during the anti-rightist campaigns and the Great Leap Forward, this was a period of intense political mobilization and a strong kind of leftward swing in the orientation of Chinese politics, with a push to basically skip stages of economic development and rapidly industrialize the country. Downstream of that was a move to also similarly accelerate the process of ethnic fusion. After a few years, much as the economic policy also sort of shifted back toward the center, ethnic policy followed as well. But you do periodically see these swings toward that. So some of what we see today is kind of built into the political system of the PRC. Of course, part of what we see is also a response to more recent history. And here I think it's important to highlight a few developments in the past few decades that may have, in the eyes of Xi Jinping and really many people in the central government, made the fact of ethnic diversity even more of a problem than it was initially understood to be. One of these is the breakup of the Soviet Union, right, which, at least to a large extent, was accelerated and facilitated by ethno-national mobilization among the Soviet Union's minority nationalities. And more recently, the global war on terror, led by the United States, but something that China has very much used to its advantage in terms of justifying its own treatment of Uyghurs. There's a real fear, I think, of terrorism and association of terrorism with, extremist Islam. And so, these factors together make ethnic difference, and particularly Muslim ethnic difference, even more prominent of a problem in China today.
Thank you, Aaron. You mentioned the war on terrorism and China's association of the Muslim population with terrorism. How worried is China of Islam? And has this translated into increased surveillance and harsher treatment of Muslim minorities throughout China? We're all aware of reporting on Chinese internment, mass re-education, and forced labor of Uyghurs, as well as other policies towards them. But how much has this policy been extended to other Muslim minorities in China, such as the Hui that you've talked about?
So it's true that the Uyghurs, and really we should say minorities who reside within Xinjiang, so that also includes in some cases Kazakhs and Uzbeks and members of other groups, and as well as the Hui. But outside of Xinjiang, on the one hand, the sort of ethnic and religious policies have been less draconian, and you don't have mass internment and other measures that have been reported. On the other hand, you do still have a very aggressive campaign to transform Islam, and from the government's point of view, to make Islam Chinese, to sinicize it. So 中国化, this is the official rhetoric, to turn it into something Chinese. And, I actually just returned from a field trip to China for a few weeks. And I was struck by, even in central China, not just in large cities, but even in rural villages, the extent to which the state's campaign is really apparent and total. So, for example, there's been a push, and this has been reported in the Financial Times and other places, to transform the architecture of mosques, to sinicize them, to make them Chinese. And this means getting rid of domes and in some cases minarets, or at least covering them up and replacing them with your sort of, almost a Disneyland cartoonish version of a kind of pagoda style design that looks in a sort of, almost cartoonish way, Chinese, recognizably so. And what I saw on my trip was that it's really not just about transforming mosques, but even Muslim restaurants and family homes, which traditionally have had signboards in front facing the street that, for example, indicate if the restaurant is halal. So it will say halal in Arabic, or it would say, Muslim restaurant or Islamic restaurant in Arabic. Many family homes, much as in sort of, the traditional Chinese village, you might on door fronts have sort of, the 对联, the two sort of vertical lines of Chinese characters. You would have those, but they would be in the traditional red and gold, but they would be Arabic rather than Chinese characters for Muslims. And signboards on top of gates and doors would also, have the Bismillah, or in the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, an important line from the Quran. And this has been completely removed and sort of taped over or removed or replaced with signboards that have no Arabic. Earlier designs had palm trees and kind of evoked a sort of Middle Eastern imagery, and have been replaced with bamboo and Chinese characters only. So even at the sort of very micro local level in Hui communities, not Uyghur ones, the campaign to make Islam look Chinese in a very crude way is quite impressive.
In terms of China's efforts to transform Islam, is that particular to Islam, or are you seeing that apply to other religions? So in other words, are there other CCP attempts to sinicize other religions, for example, such as Buddhism?
It is common across all religions. And so, official policy statements about religious policy in the PRC today will all talk about sinicization of religion or Chinification of religion. But given both international geopolitics, Islamophobia, the association of Islam and violent extremism and terrorism, it is perhaps most aggressive when it comes to Islam, and to some extent Tibetan Buddhism, although I'm less familiar with that context.
Thank you. Could you share a little bit about how China decided on the official number of 56 ethnic groups? What process did China take, and how did China come up with this very specific final number of 56 groups?
So I think it's important to understand that it was a political process. The majority of the groups that are today recognized as minority nationalities were recognized as such quite early on in the PRC period, in the early 1950s. So back then, basically shortly after taking control and winning the Civil War, the CCP and the new government of the People's Republic of China embarked on a series of surveys to figure out, to learn about the population. And they had to do so, by the way, not just for ethnic reasons, but for all sorts of reasons. They had to understand who owned land, because land reform was a major priority for the regime. They had to figure out how many people in China there were. They didn't really have reliable census data yet. And so, the process of studying what ethnic groups exist was part of a larger process of the new regime basically getting to know the population that it had just begun to rule over. So as part of that, they dispatched, teams basically of social scientists and local officials who went around, and their goal was to understand what ethnic groups does China have. One thing that's important to remember here is that at the time, and really to this day, I think, the CCP has a very strong or particular definition of what ethno-national identity means. So they take it very seriously. So in China today, one's nationality, one's ethnic affiliation is on a person's identity card. You can't just sort of change it or erase it. It's complicated. Even if you intermarry, there are rules governing what happens to your children. And this is in part a reflection of the fact that, for the Chinese Communist Party, ethno-national identity is real. It's something that will actually dictate or at least inform how people and groups behave. And they occupy different stages of development. And so it's important to kind of get this information correct, to get it right. Otherwise, you risk kind of mishandling the situation. And you can't apply, in theory at least, sort of policies designed for people for what the CCP views as the more advanced nationalities, so the Han, for less developed, less advanced nationalities until they have been equalized, until the gaps between them have been eliminated. So that's part of the motivation here. The CCP was, drawing heavily on theories from the Soviet Union, right? Their sort of tutor in all things communism at the time. So Stalin himself, in an early period in his career, Stalin had actually been in charge of sort of minority nationality affairs in the Soviet Union, and he had articulated a fourfold set of criteria for what constitutes a minority nationality. So you need to have a common territory, a common economic system, a common and distinctive language, and a common, what he calls a kind of common culture or psychology manifested in a common culture. Now, in theory, this was what they were going to apply, but in fact, very quickly they realized that politically this was not necessarily viable, that there were some groups that they wanted to recognize but did not meet all four of those criteria, and some groups that claimed to be minority nationalities but actually didn't. So in fact, although there are only 55 minorities recognized today, initially there were a couple hundred that actually claimed minority status, again, in part because it was understood to come with various benefits, the right to autonomy, and so forth. So in the kind of very messy period of the early PRC era in the 1950s, there's a lot of sort of fluctuation and inconsistencies that then gradually get flattened out and resolved. So the majority of them are counted by the early 1950s. You then have a few others that bring us from 53 or so to 56 in the later 60s, and I think the most recent one was the Jinhua in the late 1970s. But mostly this was done quite early on, and now officially, actually, there can be no more.
Thank you. We've already talked a bit about how China's minority policies have evolved over time, but maybe I could ask you, have you seen any major changes under Xi Jinping in particular? And if so, how do they differ from his predecessors or prior Chinese administrations?
So I think about change in ethnic policy in two ways. On the one hand, there's a sort of a cyclical nature to it, or a kind of pendulum swing, where we go from periods of more assimilationist policy. So, for example, imposing Mandarin or standard Mandarin over the entire population, toward more multiculturalist policies, such as not only permitting minority nationalities to use their own languages in official contexts, but actually helping them come up with scripts for those ethnic groups that did not already have a writing system. And this goes back and forth. And this sort of pendulum approach or framing of politics is something that is, we see in other aspects of Chinese politics. It's not just about ethnic policy, but it's sort of a piece with that broader, the view of Chinese politics as swinging from periods of more repression to relaxation and back and forth. On the other hand, I do think that there is also a sort of linear dimension to change, which really has to do with the capacity of the state. And this is something where we really have seen a change under Xi Jinping. So, the current policies really emphasize promoting a common as opposed to sort of separate, distinct minority identities. Under Xi Jinping, there is now officially a main line. This is an important term in sort of how the Chinese bureaucracy signals priorities and policy orientations. But there's now a main line of ethnic work in China, which is to forge consciousness of the community of the Chinese nation. And what that means is that you're no longer supposed to be forging consciousness of people's individual, particular ethnic identities, but it's the common Zhonghua Minzu, the Chinese nation, which includes all 56 groups, and really in many ways feels a lot just like the Han majority group and not support minority identities. In addition to this piece, which is promoting a unified national identity, we also have increasing assimilationist rhetoric in speeches. Xi Jinping himself has really articulated this and codified it as policy of promoting what he calls, this was taken from an earlier period and has been revived and intensified and made more prominent in policy, the three you could call the three inters, the sanjiao, which are jiaowang, jiaoliu, jiaorong, or promoting more context, exchange, and blending, jiaorong, of different minority nationalities. And this, to me, on the one hand, harkens back to earlier periods where we've seen calls to accelerate ethnic fusion. So in that sense, it's not necessarily new, it's just been brought back. What is new, though, I think, is the capacity of the state, of the bureaucracy that is implementing these policies. Because what we have today is a much larger and better staffed set of offices, the Nationality or Ethnic Affairs Commissions, which are now found throughout the country, which can really carry out sort of ethnic policy and at a much more sort of local micro level control what people do and attempt to basically manage identity and get rid of their minority nationality identity. So in some ways what we see today is new in terms of the intensity and capacity of the state, but not necessarily the goal.
Aaron, you mentioned earlier these ethnic offices are stationed across different regions. What roles do these offices perform? And how do they work in tandem with other Chinese government actors, such as the Ministry of Public Security?
So what I'm talking about with these offices is now they're technically called Nationality and Religious Affairs Commissions or offices. And they go down to the county level typically, and then up through the municipality, the province, and then there's a central one, the State Ethnic Affairs Commission, which is now under the United Front Work Department. So these are technically separate from the sort of security apparatus, and they are not the ones who are responsible for example, implementing the mass internment and forced labor that we see, with Uyghurs in Xinjiang. What the Nationality Affairs Commissions and the Ethnic and Religious Affairs Commissions are responsible for is really coordinating between different agencies in the government and evaluating the implementation of centrally given directives about ethnic policy. The reason why it's important from the central government's point of view to have these local offices that are implementing and monitoring the implementation of ethnic policy is that in many cases, there's actually local resistance to ethnic policy from other parts of the government. So I'm not even talking about, for example, Uyghur resistance to policies targeting Uyghurs. What I mean is that from the local government's point of view, implementing affirmative action is arguably a costly process, right? It means you need to pay attention. You need to have people in charge of making sure that you're meeting a certain quota or recruiting a certain number of minorities. You need to, if there's a perception that recruiting the minority nationalities, these are not the best candidates, but you still need to hire them. This is something that, given the constraints on local government financially and politically, there's going to be resistance against. And so having a kind of functional bureaucracy that's dedicated to making sure that these rules actually get followed is necessary, given the kind of internal competition in China's political system. It also means that you can kind of refine at a much more micro local level how policies are implemented. So that, the closer you are to the ground, so to speak, the more you can take into account local conditions. And if there's perhaps local resistance to one policy, you can tweak it in one area, but not another. For example, you are having trouble making sure that local minorities are getting employment. You can task that local ethnic affairs bureau to handle that issue. So it's about kind of the PRC as a bureaucracy allocating resources to making sure that central policies actually get implemented. And that's something that we've seen a real expansion of, I think, over the past few decades. Just to reiterate that from the CCP's point of view, affirmative action, and I think this is an interesting maybe point of tension or something that's difficult to maybe, it's not intuitive from an American sort of liberal democratic perspective. We tend to associate affirmative action with sorts of, a more liberal cause that is maybe sort of, motivated by a sense of social justice, or a social movement pressures the state to implement certain policies, reparations, affirmative action, and so forth. In the Chinese case, affirmative action is also part of facilitating long-term assimilation or ethnic fusion, right? The idea, again, is that in order for ethnic fusion to take place, you need to eliminate the differences, the inequalities, but also the cultural differences between ethnic groups. And therefore, from the government's point of view, getting the economic and material conditions of minority groups who might be relatively poor or undereducated in certain areas just for historical reasons is just as much a part of facilitating long-term assimilation and integration and ethnic fusion as are the more aggressive kind of and coercive and, let's say, in the case of Islam, Islamophobic and sort of culturally manipulative practices that get more attention in the news. So again, from both the sort of, the left hand and the right hand, or the positive aspects and the negative aspects, the long-term goal is always ethnic fusion.
Thank you. That is really fascinating. Let me now ask you, how organized are these ethnic groups, and are they able to push back against discriminatory CCP policies?
So in general, I don't think that there is a large degree of ethnic organization, and that's largely a function of China's authoritarian political system. And so much as we don't really have, we don't have a real political opposition leaving aside the ethnic issue, we don't have organized ethnic groups anymore either. And that's kind of one way in which I think the CCP has been quite effective over its, since the founding of the PRC. It's been able to effectively monopolize power. And that means that you do have, sort of nominally independent political parties, the so-called democratic parties, but they don't really constitute an actual opposition. And there isn't really a window or a forum for ethnic groups to mobilize in that way either. At least in terms of the political system, leaving aside sort of violent resistance, occasional terrorism, separatist movements. So you don't have that as part of the political system. There are cases, or I should say, platforms for very choreographed representation of minority nationalities in political contexts, right? So there are always delegates from different minority nationalities at all sorts of political functions. In terms of visual propaganda, it's still quite common to see representations of all of China's 56 ethnic groups, including the Han, standing behind Mao Zedong or other leaders. There's still the Palace of Nationalities Cultures in Beijing, which is sort of a museum dedicated to representing and portraying China's diversity and increasingly, I would say, homogenization. So there are ways in which they're represented, but it's not political representation in the sense of interest groups coalescing and taking political action. As in always, I think the CCP has been quite effective in neutralizing that threat so far.
It is discouraging, but not surprising to hear that these ethnic groups don't have much political mobilization or representation within China. But we do know there has been international attention on China's treatment of them. To what extent, from your perspective, has China's treatment of its minorities impacted China's foreign policy or tarnish China's international image?
So I think, the short answer here is that it hasn't really impacted China's foreign policy. It's not an issue. I think that the way in which it is an issue so far has been in terms of tarnishing China's, image, which already was not very good in many parts of the world. And now, the UN Human Rights Commission had a report that found evidence of crimes against humanity in Xinjiang, although it stopped short of charging genocide. The United States and a few other allies have accused China of committing genocide against the Uyghurs. In any case, those have contributed to what is already China's, I think, very unfavorable reputation in a lot of the world. But broadly speaking, it hasn't really impacted things. I think that the countries that are in a sort of competitive or antagonistic relationship with China already were. Most notably, maybe, many Muslim majority countries that one might expect to have a higher degree of sympathy for the Uyghur cause. Largely, I think, because these countries many of them at least, are not democracies and have authoritarian governments. These are especially easy to basically co-opt and buy off, and China has a very effective and appealing economic policy, Belt and Road Initiative, other bilateral trade frameworks, such that, China basically hasn't paid a price that it wouldn't have already paid, more or less, I think. I think there is maybe room for more pressure to be applied. So, I mentioned before that UN Human Rights Council's report that found evidence of human rights violations and crimes against humanity in Xinjiang. That was in the fall of 2022. It was brought to a vote as to whether even have a debate about the findings in the council. So this is not even taking action or a resolution, but even, this was a vote about a debate, which failed. And several, countries that perhaps the United States and its allies could have done more to pressure abstained. So Argentina, Brazil, India, Mexico, Ukraine, all to my knowledge, abstained from voting in favor of debating that. And so, I think in many ways, although I'm skeptical as to what the international community can do on this front, I also think that we haven't really run the experiment regarding what a concerted diplomatic effort would achieve. So I'm not optimistic. I think that China is a very, it's an increasingly strong state and, has a lot of market power that allows it to bully and just sort of push its agenda. And it's unlikely that diplomacy will work, especially now given, the U.S. is hardly in a position, given the war in Gaza and its continued support for Israel and the way that the international community, or at least much of the international community, views that, including with allegations of genocide. The U.S. will have a hard time credibly claiming to be standing up for human rights. But that's not to say that a more concerted effort couldn't achieve anything. We haven't run the experiment yet.
Given that we have not run this experiment of a greater diplomatic push to pressure China on improving the situation or treatment of its ethnic minorities, have you seen that the existing international spotlight has changed China's treatment of its minorities in any way?
So I think that, it's quite hard to know, given the just controls over information. We did see, for example, when the mass internment and the camps were initially reported in Western media. Initially, the Chinese government's strategy was to deny their existence, and then, as evidence mounted, they changed tactics and sort of rebranded them as vocational training centers. That's a narrative change. I think it was prompted by recognition that, especially in Western countries, the connotations of the word concentration camp maybe were not anticipated on the Chinese side, and there was a move to sort of shift away from that. But in terms of what was actually going on, it's difficult for me to say whether it made a difference beyond the media framing. I also think that, we've seen other narrative changes now and sort of diplomatic strategies where there's a new effort on the part of the Chinese government to rebrand Xinjiang as a beautiful tourist destination to showcase, happy Uyghurs and who are gainfully employed and very happy and grateful for the assistance that they receive from the government. And to do that, by the way, both for the domestic Chinese audience and for the foreign audience. But, as to whether that has corresponded with an actual change in the general treatment of Uyghurs, it's difficult to say. On the other hand, China is a strong state, and a lot of this is internally directed, and so I'm skeptical about what the outside world can do. The Chinese system has a way of cooling off. I mentioned before about the sort of swings from tighter to looser and more restrictive to more relaxed policies in general and in ethnic policy. And I think that from the Chinese government's point of view, they have an incentive, given that their goal in Xinjiang is in part to basically securitize and, in their view, pacify the Uyghur population. At some point, they have an incentive to say, look, if you are more, again, from the government's point of view, compliant, culturally Chinese, less of a problem, that's going to be better for you, right? I mean, they work with carrots and sticks together. So we may see some easing, but again, that may just be because of the internal logic of the Chinese system rather than because of external pressure. I think it's quite difficult to discern. And once again, we haven't really tried putting much pressure in the first place.
This is not an optimistic note to end on, but reflects the reality that we're facing in China. Aaron, thank you for this in-depth discussion of China's ethnic minority policy and its history and how we've come to the current state that we're seeing right now. I appreciate your analysis and your assessment that China's policies towards its ethnic minorities have not been significantly influenced by the existing international spotlight or criticism of China, which you mentioned is far from sufficient. Thank you again, Aaron, for joining us.
Thanks so much, Bonnie. I really appreciate your questions and interest in this topic and enjoyed our conversation.